I was fixing my veil in the reflection of a copper backsplash I had spent 3 months restoring by hand. The metal was polished to a mirror finish, which is the only reason I saw her. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, stood directly behind me, oblivious to my eyes in the copper. She just saw my drink. At my wedding, I saw my mother-in-law slip something into my glass. I switched our glasses, and when she raised the toast, I smiled. That's when the real wedding drama began. Eleanor didn't see me watching. She was too focused on the task, her fingers moving with a practiced serpentine grace. She pulled a small glass vial from her clutch. I watched 3 clear drops fall into my champagne. They vanished instantly into the bubbles. I didn't turn around. I didn't scream. I waited for her to walk away to greet a senator's wife. Most brides would be hyperventilating in the bathroom after seeing their new mother-in-law try to drug them, but I am a restoration architect. I deal with crumbling foundations and structural failures for a living. Panic is a luxury I cannot afford. What I felt in that moment was not fear. It was static load. That is the engineering term for the immense silent weight a beam carries right before it decides to either hold the roof up or snap in half. I took a breath. My hands were steady. I knew exactly how much pressure this beam could take. I reached out and touched the cool glass. Eleanor had drifted 10 feet away, distracted by her own social performance. With the steady hands of a surgeon, I simply reached out and switched our glasses. It took less than 2 seconds. Her poison was now in her hand, waiting for her return. I walked back to the head table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. I checked my pulse, 80 beats per minute. Elevated but controlled. I smoothed the silk of my dress and sat down next to Ethan. Ethan, the man who saved children's lives as a pediatric surgeon, couldn't see that his own mother was a pathogen. He squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb brushing over my ring. He looked at me with so much love it almost hurt. He whispered that I looked beautiful. He had no idea that 10 feet away, his mother was sipping champagne. She intended to be my destruction. I squeezed his hand back. I needed him to stay blind for just 5 more minutes. I looked across the table as Eleanor finally sat down. She held court with my parents, laughing at something my father said, playing the role of the benevolent matriarch perfectly. She looked at me. Her eyes were cold, dead things buried under layers of expensive mascara. She raised her glass, my glass, in a silent toast to me. A little smirk played on her lips that said checkmate. She thought she was the architect of this moment. She was about to learn about demolition. I picked up my water glass. My hand did not shake. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was cold. It tasted like clarity against the rising heat in the room. I watched Eleanor swirl the champagne. She was so confident in her cruelty. She thought I was just some lucky girl who had stumbled into her dynasty. A problem to be solved with a checkbook or a vial of chemicals. She forgot one crucial thing about architects. She had spent the last 2 years trying to bulldoze me. She treated me like a squatter in her son's life. She called my work dirty because I come home with dust in my hair. But she forgot that restoration architects know exactly where the weak points are. We know exactly when a structure is about to collapse. I set my glass down on the linen tablecloth. I smiled back at her and I waited. The collapse was inevitable now. To understand why I didn't stop her, why I didn't grab her wrist and scream for the police right then, you have to understand the architecture of our war. This wasn't a sudden crime of passion. This was the demolition phase of a project Eleanor had been managing for 2 years. From the moment Ethan introduced us, I was a zoning violation in her perfectly curated world. The Sterlings are what people call old money, which usually just means dusty money. They are terrified of anyone who actually works for a living. I met Eleanor at the estate inspection. I was wearing work boots and a hard hat, covered in drywall dust. She looked at my hands like they were contagious. She asked Ethan right in front of me if he was hiring the help for some remodeling. When he told her I was his girlfriend, she didn't smile. She just said, "Oh." The insults were never loud. They were structural. They were small cracks in the foundation designed to make me collapse over time. She would conveniently forget to invite me to family dinners. She would introduce me to their friends as Ethan's little project manager, ignoring my master's degree and my license. I took it all in silence for Ethan's sake. But the real structural failure happened 6 months ago. I was sitting in her library, surrounded by books she had never read. She slid a creamy envelope across the mahogany desk. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000. She told me it was a severance package. She leaned forward, her pearls clicking against the desk. "You are a lovely girl, Valentina," she said. "But let's be realistic. You are new money. You build things. We own things. You will never be comfortable at this table. And I am just trying to save you the embarrassment of trying." It was more money than my parents made in 2 years. I looked at the check. I looked at her. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it in her face. I just slid it back across the desk. "I think you are underestimating the cost of labor, Eleanor," I said. "I am not for sale." That was the moment her eyes changed. That was when I stopped being a nuisance and became a threat. And in Eleanor's world, threats have to be neutralized, no matter the cost. In psychology, there is a concept known as an extinction burst. I learned about it when I was studying how stress affects building materials, but it applies perfectly to narcissists like Eleanor. When a toddler realizes that screaming isn't getting them what they want, they don't quiet down. They scream louder. They flail. They break things. They escalate their behavior to a frantic peak right before they finally give up. It is the last desperate explosion of energy to force control. The week before the wedding was Eleanor's extinction burst. She realized the bribes hadn't worked. The insults hadn't cracked the foundation. The wedding was going to happen, so she went scorched earth. On Tuesday, she called our florist and tried to cancel the order, claiming the bride had died in a car accident. The florist, thank God, called me first. I had to explain I was very much alive while standing in my kitchen, staring at a dead phone line. On Thursday, I found her in the bridal suit inspecting my veil. When she left, there was a jagged tear right through the lace. She claimed it caught on her diamond ring, but I know the tensile strength of French lace. You have to want to rip it. You have to apply sheer force. I fixed the veil with gold thread, a technique I use in restoration. I didn't tell Ethan. I knew that if I told him, she would spin it. She would gaslight him instantly. She would call me paranoid, say I was stressed, and imagining things. She banked on the fact that her behavior was so insane that no rational person would believe it. It is a specific kind of camouflage. If you act monstrous enough, people assume it must be an accident, because surely no mother would do that. So I stayed silent. I let her think she had won that round. I wore the gold, threaded veil as armor. So when I saw the vial at the reception, everything clicked into place. This wasn't random. This wasn't just hatred. This was the final detonation of her extinction burst. She couldn't stop the wedding, so she decided to ruin the memory of it. She wanted me sick. She wanted me humiliated. She wanted to prove to every high society guest in that room that I was weak, messy, and unworthy of the sterling name. She wanted a disaster to prove her point. She didn't just want to spoil the night. She wanted to create a scene that would linger for decades. She wanted me vomiting on the dance floor, unable to stand, looking like a drunk or a junkie. She wanted to look at Ethan with sad eyes and say, "I told you she wasn't cut out for this life." It was a brutal calculation. But she made a critical error in her assessment of the structural load. She forgot that I construct safety systems for a living. I looked at the glass in her hand. The bubbles were still rising, carrying whatever chemical agent she had deemed necessary. She wanted a tragedy. She wanted a collapse. I just decided to let her be the victim of it. I adjusted my napkin on my lap and watched her throat work as she swallowed another sip. The demolition was about to begin, and I had the front row seat. The reception hall was loud with applause as Ethan finished his speech. He was charming, self-effacing, and absolutely perfect. He sat down and kissed my cheek, whispering that he was the luckiest man alive. I squeezed his hand, my palm slightly damp against his dry skin. He had no idea what was coming. Then the room went quiet. The tapping of a spoon against crystal echoed like a warning bell. Eleanor stood up. She looked regal in her silver gown, a shark in silk. She held the champagne flute high in the air. It was the one with the gold rim. The one she had tainted mere minutes ago. The room waited, captivated by her performance. She smiled at the guests, then turned her gaze to me. It was a predator's smile, sharp and lacking warmth. Marriage. She began, her voice projecting with that practiced finishing school cadence. Is about partnership. It is about knowing who you are and, more importantly, where you come from. A few of her friends at table 4 chuckled softly. They knew the code. They knew where you come from was a polite way of pointing out my lack of pedigree. Eleanor continued, her eyes never leaving mine. It is about understanding your place in the legacy. She paused for effect, letting the word legacy hang in the air like a guillotine blade. I didn't flinch. I kept my face smooth, a mask of polite interest. She was enjoying this too much. And most importantly, she said, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, it is about trust. Knowing that the person sitting next to you has your best interests at heart. She looked me dead in the eye on the word trust. The audacity was breathtaking. She was lecturing me on betrayal, while holding a poisoned weapon in her manicured hand. I didn't blink. I raised my water glass in a silent challenge. I wanted her to see that I understood the game. Eleanor raised the poisoned chalice higher. The light caught the bubbles, making them sparkle innocently. To the happy couple, she said. Her voice was steady, void of any tremor of conscience. May you get exactly what you deserve. It was a curse wrapped in a blessing. The guests murmured their agreement, raising their glasses in unison. To the happy couple, they echoed. I brought my water to my lips. Eleanor brought the champagne to hers. The trap was finally sprung. She tipped the glass back. I watched the golden liquid disappear. I watched her throat move. 1 gulp, 2. She drained it. She wanted to make sure every drop of the toxin entered my system, so she finished it all. She lowered the glass, leaving a smudge of lipstick on the rim. For a moment, nothing happened. The world didn't stop. She just stood there, looking triumphant. She had no idea she had just swallowed her own malice. She sat down, smoothing her skirt. She turned to my father and started talking about his golf handicap, dismissing me entirely. She thought the deed was done. She thought in 20 minutes, I would be clutching my stomach in agony. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I wasn't listening to the conversation. I was counting the seconds like a metronome in my head. 2, 3. The chemical reaction had started. Now, we just had to wait for the collapse. 1 minute passed. Then 2. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, counting the seconds like a metronome. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the groaning started. It wasn't loud at first. It was the sound of a beam shifting under too much weight. Eleanor stopped talking mid-sentence. She blinked rapidly, her hand going to her throat. Her face, usually a mask of heavy foundation and composure, turned a violent shade of gray. The demolition was right on schedule. She tried to stand up, maybe to excuse herself to the restroom. But gravity had other plans. Her knees buckled under the sudden shift in equilibrium. She grabbed the tablecloth to steady herself, pulling a centerpiece of expensive lilies down with her. The vase shattered against the floor, a sharp crack that silenced the nearby tables. Water soaked into the hem of her silver gown. She looked around wildly, eyes wide and unfocused. She was losing structural integrity fast. Then the emetic did exactly what chemistry dictated it must do. It wasn't a polite swoon or a delicate cough. It was violent. Eleanor retched, a guttural, ugly sound that silenced the string quartet instantly. She vomited directly onto the head table, all over the silk runner, the china, and the skirt of her custom-made gown. The smell hit us instantly, sharp and acidic. The woman who had spent 60 years cultivating an image of untouchable perfection was now hiving on the floor. "Mom!" Ethan shouted, jumping up from his chair. The movement knocked his own chair backward with a clatter. "Mom!" He scrambled over the mess to get to her. She looked up at him, gasping for air between dry heaves. "I don't..." She slurred, her voice thick and wet. "I don't feel..." She collapsed sideways into the mess she had made. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests stood up, craning their necks to see the ruin. I stayed seated for 1 second longer, watching the absolute destruction of the sterling matriarch. It was ugly. It was tragic. And it was exactly what she had ordered for me. This was the scene she had curated for my humiliation, simply recast with a new lead actress. In a crisis, most people panic. As the guests screamed and crowded around, offering napkins and useless advice, I finally stood up. I didn't rush. I moved with the calm authority of a site manager. I signaled the DJ to cut the ambient music. I directed the coordinator to clear a path for the paramedics. Ethan was on the floor with her, checking her vitals, his surgeon training kicking in automatically. He was shouting commands. Pulse thready. Airways clear. Pupils dilated. He was terrified. He was trying to save the woman who had just tried to poison his wife. I watched him work, feeling a strange detachment. He was fighting biology. I was fighting history. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. They loaded Eleanor onto the stretcher. She was barely conscious, moaning something incoherent about the heat. As they lifted her, her beaded clutch bag slid off her lap and hit the floor. The clasp snapped open on impact. Contents spilled across the hardwood: a lipstick, a compact mirror, and a small empty glass vial. Ethan saw it. He froze. But that wasn't the smoking gun. Next to the vial was a piece of heavy cream, colored stationery. Ethan stared at the vial rolling on the floorboards. It was small, unassuming, and undeniably damning. He looked like a man waking up from a long, comfortable dream into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Around us, the wedding guests were murmuring, a chorus of confusion and pity that Eleanor would have hated. The paramedics were shouting instructions, lifting the stretcher, but Ethan wasn't moving. He was paralyzed by the physics of the situation. His mother. A vial. A sudden, violent illness. The math was horrifyingly simple. I walked over to him, my dress brushing against the scattered contents of her life. I didn't look at the lipstick or the mirror. I reached down and picked up the folded square of cream, colored stationery. It was heavy stock, expensive. The kind she used for thank you notes and invitations. I knew what it was before I opened it. It felt cold in my hand. I watched Ethan's eyes track my movement. He looked lost. He needed an anchor, but I was about to give him an anvil. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Eleanor's elegant, looping script, practiced and perfect. I read the first line and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't a grocery list. It wasn't a reminder. It was a script. I walked closer to Ethan, stepping into his personal space until I was the only thing he could see. "Ethan," I said, my voice low and cutting through the noise. "You need to read this right now." He looked at me, confused, his brow furrowed in pain. He took the paper with a trembling hand. I watched his eyes scan the words. "Ladies and gentlemen," the note began. "I must apologize for the interruption. My new daughter-in-law has struggled for years with personal demons." Ethan stopped reading. He looked up at me, then back at the paper. "We hoped the stress of the wedding wouldn't trigger a relapse, but it seems the alcohol was too much." The words were a weapon. "Please forgive the mess," he whispered, reading the final line aloud. "We will get her the help she needs." It was a speech. It was a speech she had written before the reception even started. She hadn't just planned to make me sick physically. She had planned the narrative of my total social destruction. She was going to frame my poisoning as a drunken, bulimic breakdown. She intended to take the microphone while I was vomiting and destroy my reputation forever. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. I saw the change happen in Ethan's face. It is a rare and terrible thing to watch a man become an orphan while his mother is still standing. The concern for her health vanished. The panic vanished. His eyes went cold, the pupils contracting as the light of understanding hit them. He looked at the note, then at the empty vial on the floor, then at the retreating stretcher. He finally saw the architecture of the trap. He realized the monster wasn't under the bed. The monster was the woman who had tucked him in at night. She was the one who had kissed his scraped knees and paid for his medical school. And she was the one who had just tried to incinerate his marriage to save her own ego. He folded the note with terrifying precision and put it in his tuxedo pocket. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his father, who was weeping softly in a chair nearby. He looked at the lead paramedic. "She didn't have a stroke," Ethan said. His voice sounded like grinding metal. Stripped of all warmth, the paramedic stopped, looking back at him. "Excuse me, sir?" Ethan walked over, stepping over the spilled contents of the purse without a downward glance. "She didn't have a stroke or a heart attack. She ingested an emetic and a sedative. The vial is on the floor." The room went dead silent. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ethan was diagnosing the toxicity of his own bloodline. "And call the police?" Ethan added. The words were final. He turned back to me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a grim determination. He grabbed my hand, his grip tight enough to bruise. "We are going to the hospital," he said. "Not to visit. To give a statement." I nodded. The guests parted for us like the Red Sea, staring in morbid fascination. We walked out of the ruined reception, leaving the shattered lilies and the smell of sickness behind us. The drive to the hospital was silent. Ethan stared out the window, watching the city blur past. I didn't try to comfort him. You cannot comfort someone who is undergoing an amputation. You can only hold the tourniquet. He was severing the limb that was killing us. The note in his pocket was the scalpel. Eleanor had written her own ending, but she had handed the pen to the wrong person. She thought she was writing a tragedy for me. She wrote a confession for herself. The hospital hallway smelled like industrial antiseptic and bad decisions. It was a sharp contrast to the lilies and champagne of the reception we had just fled. Eleanor was stabilized in a private room. The drugs flushed from her system, but the legal toxicity was just beginning. Two officers stood near the nurses' station, their radios crackling with low static. Officer Cardona, a man with tired eyes and a notebook that looked weary of family dramas, approached us. I didn't need to be emotional. I needed to be efficient. "Mrs. Sterling," the officer asked, looking between me and Ethan. "We need a statement regarding the incident." I nodded and pulled my phone from my clutch. While the paramedics were loading Eleanor, I had texted the venue manager. Because I had restored the Sterling estate, I knew exactly where the blind spots were, and more importantly, where the security camera behind the bar was angled. I had the footage in my inbox before the ambulance reached the hospital. I have video, I said simply. I handed the phone to Officer Cardona. He tapped the screen, and the small video played in the harsh fluorescent light. Timestamp 2:40, 7 p.m. Eleanor looks around furtively. She pulls the vial. She drops the poison. It was high-definition proof of a felony, captured in cold pixels. The officer watched it twice, his expression hardening into professional grimness. "That's clear," he muttered, handing the phone back to me. "Is she awake?" Ethan answered before I could. "Yes," he said, his voice void of warmth. We walked into Eleanor's room. She looked small in the hospital bed, the wires and monitors stripping away her usual armor of grandeur. My father, in-law, sat in the corner chair, his head in his hands, looking like a man whose world had just evaporated. Eleanor turned her head as we entered. Her skin was pale, but her eyes held a flicker of that old, dangerous spark. She wasn't sorry. She was calculating her next move. She looked past me, fixing her gaze entirely on her son. "Ethan," she rasped, her throat raw from the emetic. "Thank God you are here. You have to explain to them." She gestured vaguely toward the door. It was a mistake. A terrible mix-up. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, rigid as a steel beam. "Did you confess?" he asked. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I told them I did it to save you. I told them she is a gold digger ruining the Sterling bloodline. You'll thank me one day." I watched Ethan. This was the moment. The structural cord was either going to snap, or it was going to strangle us both. Eleanor had played her final card. The mother knows best defense. She was banking on 30 years of guilt, tuition payments, and social obligation to make him drop the charges. She thought she owned him. Ethan reached into his tuxedo pocket. He didn't pull out a tissue to wipe her brow. He pulled out the cream-colored stationery, folded into a sharp, condemning square. "Officer," Ethan said, turning his back on his mother. Officer Cardona stepped forward. "This is evidence of premeditation." Ethan handed over the paper. "My mother didn't just try to assault my wife. She planned a character assassination. She wrote this speech before the reception started. This proves intent." Eleanor gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a seal breaking. She recognized the paper. She realized her script had been found. "Ethan," she whispered, the confidence finally draining out of her face. "Ethan. Don't." His father whispered from the chair. He stood up shakily, looking between his wife and his son. "She's your mother. We can handle this internally. We have lawyers." It was the Sterling way. Bury the rot under a pile of money, and pretend the foundation is sound. Ethan turned to his father. His face was a mask of tragic resolve. "No," he said. "She is a criminal, and if you pay for her lawyer, you are an accomplice to attempted poisoning." Ethan turned back to the officer, ignoring his father's stunned silence. "I am pressing charges," he stated clearly. "Aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. And I am requesting an immediate emergency restraining order for myself and my wife." I watched him sign the statement the officer offered. It was the most romantic thing I had ever seen. He didn't just choose me. He amputated the limb that was killing us. He cut her off with the precision of a surgeon removing a gangrenous tumor. There were no tears from Ethan, just the scratching sound of a pen on paper, finalizing the divorce between a son and his toxic origin. Eleanor started to scream then, a ragged, desperate sound that followed us out into the hallway. Ethan took my hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was solid. We walked past the nurse's station, past the security guard, and out into the night air. The hospital doors slid shut behind us, cutting off the sound of her voice forever. It has been 12 months since the wedding reception imploded. Eleanor is currently serving a 24-month sentence for aggravated assault. Her high-priced legal team tried to argue diminished capacity, painting her as a confused elderly woman. But the pre-written note destroyed that defense completely. You cannot claim temporary insanity when you drafted a press release about it 3 days in advance. Ethan and I didn't move into the Sterling estate. We bought a fixer-upper on the other side of the city to start over. The house has good bones, but it needs serious work, just like us. I am sanding down the banister, while Ethan paints the spare room a soft yellow. He looks younger now than he did a year ago. The weight of the dynasty is off his shoulders. He doesn't speak to his father, who chose to stand by Eleanor's checkbook, rather than his son's safety. We lost a fortune in inheritance, but we gained something far more valuable: silence. The quiet here is real. I step away from the banister to sit at our kitchen table. In front of me lies a ceramic bowl I broke last week. It was a clean break, right down the center. I am using a Japanese technique called kintsugi to repair it. You don't hide the cracks. You fill them with a special lacquer, mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy is that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. The break is where the history lives. It is where the strength is. For a long time, I thought a perfect marriage meant no conflict. I thought it meant smooth surfaces, easy days, and ignored flaws. But Eleanor taught me something valuable in her cruelty. She tried to shatter us. She tried to find the stress points and hammer them until we crumbled into dust. But she miscalculated the materials. When we sat in that hospital waiting room watching the police lead her away in handcuffs, Ethan and I didn't fall apart. We fused. The trauma didn't leave a scar that aches in the rain. It left a seam of gold. We trust each other with a depth that most couples never reach because they are never truly tested. I know with absolute certainty that he will choose me over his bloodline. And he knows that I will see the threats he is blind to. We are not the shiny, pristine couple on the wedding topper anymore. We are something heavier, grounded, and impossible to break. I finish the bowl, carefully wiping away the excess gold dust. The lines catch the afternoon sun, shining brighter than the original ceramic ever did. It is imperfect. It is jagged, and it is stronger than it was before the fall. Ethan walks into the kitchen, paint on his cheek, and kisses the top of my head. He sees the bowl and smiles. We don't hide the damage in this house. We highlight it because we survived the demolition.